I'm just here to really help you guys and walk you through oysters a little bit more, try to give you a little bit more background knowledge into them, and hopefully we can push more out of here and really run up your tabs and make you some extra money, you know, because it's a quick way to get that tab up there. Now, oysters, if you don't know, are bivalves. Their job in the ecosystem is to clean water. Like wine, we all know that the environment in which it is produced, the terroir, is going to change the wine, the grape, and everything. So I can have a Pinot coming out of France that's going to be completely different than one out of Argentina or California. Oysters are, you know, they're a variety of bivalve that essentially we have several species throughout the world. There are the West Coast oysters, there are the Gulf and the Chesapeake oysters, and then there are the East Coast oysters. And each one of those are going to be very similar. However, there are slight differences depending on what river or cove or bay, wherever you're getting them out of, because those regions even shrink down into your southern Atlantic region, your mid-Atlantic. You've got New England oysters and Canadian oysters. And you'll even see differences if you're looking at Massachusetts, inside the Cape there versus outside the Cape, from the water moving around. Inside the Cape, consistently down there, it's going to keep those oysters much cooler throughout the year than the ones that are out facing the Gulf Stream on the outside of Massachusetts there. So you really do have to look at the rivers, and that's why your Beausoleils on your test, it said why are they coming, or where are they coming out of during the winter months versus the summer months. It really does matter. It does change them. So your West Coast oysters, which I know you don't have a lot of here, but I'll just kind of give you an idea. Unlike your East Coast, they are not round very well on the oyster itself. They're scalloped and they're very dark. The shell inside is very dark. What you have on the oyster itself right here on the outer edge, it's going to also be super dark, where the oyster itself is almost white, where ours is almost this tannish color. And those are actually, you're going to taste a lot of metallic flavors out of it. You're going to taste the kelp that they're in, because the West Coast, the tides don't shift as much as they do here on the East Coast. Because of all the kelp and seaweed and the grass and stuff that's growing down in there, and they're filtering that. Some people, those flavors come off as cucumbers or even a melon, and that's quite interesting. So that's fun ones to play with. When we look at our East Coast seaboard here, we do get a little sweetness in ours, but not like they would see in a West Coast. If someone really likes a sweet oyster, they're probably thinking of a West Coast oyster. Our oysters are very briny, they're very salty. They can come plump and silky, smooth. There's all different varieties of them. I tend to like, for myself, the South Atlantic. Right here on the South Carolina coast, we have very rich waters that produce phenomenal oysters. All this bluff mud you're smelling out there and all that can smell a little foul, that's a lot of nutrients that these oysters are picking up and cleaning, and it brings out a very briny, almost harsh oyster. It's very salty. Some people don't care for that. They want something cleaner. And so what you're looking for if they want a cleaner oyster is up in New England. They got a lot more rock and sand up in that area. And so the oysters are cleaning that, and it's keeping them, like I said, a lot cleaner and not as heavily briny as our South Carolina oyster. Let's see, what else about oysters? The reason I always put the Chesapeake and the Gulf Coast together, the Chesapeake used to be very similar to our East Coast. They're the same exact oyster variety, but between 1880 and 1920, they harvested 150 billion pounds of oyster meat a year, and they pretty much by 1920 had taken over half of the oyster beds out of the Chesapeake. By the 1970s, with pollution and modern factories and all the rivers flowing in there and the continual harvest of the oysters, they're noticing the Chesapeake was getting very dirty. It was hurting their blue crab, population, and they decided they had to do something to fix this. So they put a lot of environmental programs in that kept the pollution out of the water, but now we have to actually start cleaning the bay itself. So they brought up from the Gulf Coast a lot of oysters and set up sanctuaries all along the Chesapeake. Now, even though they are a similar oyster in the same family, the introduction of the larger Gulf oyster into the Chesapeake, did still change the oyster there. And once it started breaking out of the sanctuaries and started producing wild and spawning with the natural oysters that were produced there, they were reopening, and they have productions back up to a nice level now, so you can get a lot of Chesapeake oysters. But that introduction between the 70s and today, because the over-harvesting has really changed them, so they wouldn't be the same as an oyster you'd get from New Jersey or off the coast in Virginia. It's quite a big difference. They would taste more similar to a Gulf than they would a Virginia or North Carolina oyster, even though, the distance there would be less. Another reason that is because all those freshwater rivers are causing the Chesapeake to be a lot more brackish in nature and not as salty as the outside Atlantic. A few things that some people might say when they come in here. I hear this a lot at raw bars. We don't have to worry about that right now, but I'm sure you heard R months. Everyone's concerned about eating oysters outside of months that don't have an R in it. It's like May, June, July, August, they say I cannot eat an oyster there. In South Carolina, we shut down our oyster fields during those months, and the reason is the water temperatures on average for the week rise above 70 degrees, and the warmer water really spawns a lot of bacteria. So the hotter water you're coming out of, the more bacteria is going to be there. And if you eat an oyster that's cleaned, doing that cleansing process as a bivalve, if it's cleaning that bacteria, then it's going to be introduced into your system. It can make you very sick. You can go to the hospital. So why can we have oysters outside of those R months, on our raw bar and, sell it to customers year round? We are going into cold enough waters. You're going into New England and Canada where the waters stay below that 70 degrees on average, and it is safe to serve those. Our oyster season here will probably end March. You'll start looking at it much closer. April, pretty much you won't be seeing South Carolina oysters coming out too much. There are a few guys that are trying to push that. They're saying they're raising them far enough up, and they have these cold water dry docks that they store them in or something that they can harvest them year round. Most people are not going for that around here. So you can always let them know that we're getting oysters from waters that are keeping a average of below 70 degrees, so it's perfectly safe for them to eat raw. Now, to open an oyster, what we have here on the oyster is on the hinge on the back. That's where we'll go in. Most shuckers will use this. It's the most simplest form to open a raw oyster. I have here an oyster blade. You can see it is pointed up towards a little bit. I will have that still facing up. I'll put it in the hinge and get it nice and firm in there, and then I just use my forearm, and I twist. It comes open. Then I'm going to pop it up, slide the blade down the top here so that you can remove that top muscle. The top muscle is going to have that darker spot on the inside of the shell. There's probably still little fragments of shell there, or clear that off, and then what you want to do is flip the oyster around, use your blade, and with essentially one movement, remove the muscle in the oyster so that it can slide around, and guests do not have to worry about trying to fork that out of there or whatever. They can just pick it up and slurp it right back. So that is the easiest way to do it. They also said you can go in on the side. I do know some shuckers that do that. We'll see if I can today. I am not an expert at going in on the side, but what they say the reason for going in on the side is that it breaks down the amount of shell you get in to the oyster itself, which I don't think I'll be able to do. Let's see. So yep, well, took a little bit, but essentially you can go in on the side where the muscle is always going to be about here, and you really have to work it in with the sharp blade, but you can get the shell open that way, and by pulling it back you're not messing with the hinge, and it's pretty much keeping any shell fragments from possibly being there. It's a lot harder of a shuck to do, especially at a raw bar when we're trying to get stuff out, at a little faster pace. As you saw, it was much more difficult for me, but the oyster is still very well maintained, and it is possible. So there's another. And then some people do the going through the front, right up here. I'm not going to try that one, but yeah, I've seen it done. And again, that's the same idea as you're keeping shell out of it, but it's a lot slower of a process. Essentially the best way, like I said, is to go in the back through the hinge, get it in firm, and then just twist. It comes up. Remove that top muscle, get a little shell out of there, and it's good to go. So one thing people do look at is the depth of the cup on the bottom of the oyster. Let's see, this was a Blue Point out of Connecticut. Blue Points actually were originally off a point in New York Harbor. At turn of century, I mentioned 1880 to 1920. There were more oyster carts in New York, and that's what people would stop to eat than anything else. It was like the hot dog stand of its time. People at that time loved oysters. They ate a bunch of them. They over-harvested it a lot. And like the Chesapeake oyster, they over-harvested and got rid of the Blue Point oyster. It was that was like 1920s. All of a sudden in the 70s, people are saying they've refound the Chesapeake oyster, like people are seeing the Black Panther in South Carolina again, even though it's been extinct here for a little while. I don't know if this is the same Blue Point that was there then, because I did not live at that time. But I will tell you that they are now harvesting Blue Point oysters from Connecticut and Rhode Island all the way down to the Delaware Bay, which is in Delaware, New Jersey. They're all saying it's the same oyster, it's got the same taste, the same flavor profile, but it does not.
They're harvesting them from where to where?
From Connecticut, Rhode Island, all the way down the coastline, almost to central mid-Atlantic there in Delaware and New Jersey. The Blue Points are a great oyster. They are phenomenal. They would make my top 10 list easily for oysters. And there's over 300 species of oysters in North America alone, the North American continent. So to make that list, that's a great oyster. They're always big, they're always meaty, very salty and briny. But what we do to make sure that consistency, since the bays and rivers will change the flavor so much, is we make sure to get our Blue Points from Connecticut. That's what I've found, and a lot of big oyster connoisseurs have found that the top Blue Points come out of Connecticut. We pay more for them, sometimes 50 cents more an oyster than the ones I could get from New Jersey and New York. And especially New York's not very far away from Connecticut. Why am I spending 50 cents more an oyster at my cost? Because it's just that much better. They do have distinctively a very flat top. They're very smooth oysters. The bottoms can get kind of on the back here. You have all these little holes in there, like a piece of wood that has worms, kind of eating it out. That's going to make the back of these very brittle. It can slow up the process of shucking an oyster. When you're having problems with that, you can always flip your blade over upside down, which will disperse the amount of pressure you're putting on that center part off to both sides. Or you can use a straighter blade and kind of puncture your way straight through the muscle and then open it. But these do have on the bottom, they are a little bit thicker and they come down more, so it typically holds a lot of its juice, its liquor. So there's your blue point oyster, and you see I got some shells right here on the edge. I'm just going to move off, clear that mussel with a swipe, and plate it up. This was the...
This one is Plymouth Rock.
Plymouth? Okay,
This
Plymouth
is
Rock.
Right here.
So Plymouth Rock from Rhode Island is right next door to your Connecticut oyster. If I'm just guessing here from Rhode Island, I'm going to say that it's going to be a silky smooth oyster. It's going to have salty nectar or liquor. Liquor would be a more industry term. Growing up here, we always called it the nectar. So the meat will be sweet and the liquor is going to be salty on this one. Does anyone want to try an oyster?
Yes.
All right, that's fine.
That's the score.
Yeah, just like regular liquor.
Yeah, I was about to say we've had those Scorpion Creek deserts.
All right.
This one right here.
Yeah.
I want to taste Rhode Island.
This is Rhode Island.
That's Rhode Island.
Me too at first. Until
See the shell they break off. It's like, wow.
Yeah. So I really would not recommend doing this in your bare hands. I've had plenty of cuts in my life and handling these a little while.
I was just saying, oysters are very sharp.
They are sharp. I've actually gotten more cuts shucking oysters just by reaching in and picking them up and cutting myself on the edge of the oyster than I have from actually attempting the opening or the knife. So you want to try the Plymouth? For the knives? All right, so there's there's 20 different varieties of oyster knives. I mean, here's one using a certain variety. We've all seen the ones use an oyster roast, correct? Shuckers, for the most part, are going to use your Duxbury blade and your Nantucket blade. And it's just a different process. The straighter one, it does not have a curve on it. And when you're using it, you're going to find the spot and you're just going to push in. Like I just use force, push, there's no twist. And I pretty much just, by sheer willpower, got that open. So I only use these when I'm having oysters that are very brittle on the back, and when I try to twist, they're cracking and breaking all over the place and I'm just ruining my oysters. Then I'm going to try going straight in and try to salvage as many oysters that way. Did you want to try the blue? Here's a blue point right there. You like that Plymouth?
It's salty.
Yeah.
It's saltier than the Gulf.
All right. What would you like?
Cocktail sauce, horseradish.
Horseradish?
No, that whatever the hell it's called is pretty good.
Scorpion Creeks are phenomenal little oysters to sell.
Just eat it.
Swallow it. Don't chew it.
You never had one raw?
I don't eat seafood.
Go with a little cocktail sauce and that would probably help you some. There you
Sauce
go.
is always good.
Once you get used to them, once you get used to a raw oyster, for someone's first time, I'd definitely always say use cocktail, use whatever's going to make you most comfortable. You know, they are alive. Yes.
And then they die in your belly.
Correct.
The, like acidity in your stomach or something.
Yeah.
You know, actually have them, they'll have like little crabs.
Yes.
They're still seed and they'll have little crabs that will still be in them and they will still be alive.
You can see them like
No.
they move.
It will not.
And
These
most
ones
people
are
eat them
alive
for
right
life.
now.
So everyone, we had a question about a table that wanted y'all to warm up the oysters in a warm bath before they ate them. And you're wondering why we keep them on ice and keep them cold. Once the oyster comes, like it's in a hibernation state right now on ice. It's shocked. It's in hibernation. It's still alive. That warm water will reinvigorate it and it will start opening and try to do its job, and clean some water. So it's not dead yet. It's going to still take it some time. If I have an oyster that's open here, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it, because if it's opening up on ice, then it's pretty bad at that point. But to warm it up in water, you're not going to cause any problem for it. It would be essentially like boiling the oyster like we do at an oyster roast. That's all they're trying to do to it. It's still going to be alive for a little bit until it gets too hot, and then it's just going to be boiling itself.
So that's okay.
That is okay.
Customers, no.
It's great.
I would just try to, steer people from it. But when you have that customer that wants that, I don't see a problem with doing it at all.
Because that lady came in, she came in, and had done like that again.
So like this
Cinnamon in one bucket for like a couple minutes.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
they did. That's what they did. They just put her.
That'd be fine.
so like this would be dead. Would you consider that dead?
Yes.
The shell?
No, the oyster inside, would it still be good even though it has a little crack in it?
Yes.
She seemed like she.
All right,
like,
so
wanted
Leroy
that.
just pulled this one out, and this does happen at raw bars. You can see it's very thinly opened there on the front, right there. Essentially, if I can, without any problem, put a knife in here and do that, it's not good. If it's on ice and it's
What makes
doing
it
that,
not good?
Looks like that.
then it is starting to die. You know,
How can you tell the difference?
'Cause
it was cracked open.
But as
No,
far
I
as
know,
like
Yeah,
the
looking
but-
at them, you
inside,
can't
looking
tell
at
the
them.
difference.
Looking at them, it will start getting a lot darker. And once it dies, sometimes they die and they're still in the shell, and you crack it open, it's going to be black.
Is that why it's got the black on it?
Yeah, it's starting to get
Ours?
blacker. And it smells. If you've ever changed a baby's diaper,
Yeah, it's
then you know how a dead oyster smells. And it's worse than a baby's diaper. It's a baby's diaper times 100. It will stink up your restaurant. So someone coming and saying, my oyster's bad, one easy way to do is to smell it. If it doesn't have a bad smell, then it's probably not bad, especially if we had to shuck it open and it's been kept on ice properly. But, we are eating live animals. They are cleaning bacteria. So in every case, we're not going to argue with the client. If they say my oyster's bad and we'll apologize, we'll get another one for them, When in doubt, throw it out with an oyster. Don't play with them. Just say, I'm not comfortable with this one, and get another.
The
So,
one with the deep cup right there that he has, that is the.
It's a Malbec by the shell. Hold on, I'll turn it
Why
over
is it white?
in 5 seconds.
why is the shell white?
No, is that just shell?
Yeah, so this is where the muscle
That's
is.
the Malbec.
And you can always tell where the muscle is if you've looked at enough oysters.
That white part is what?
That's your, this here is just the inside of the shell. That would be where the muscle lines up.
The white look kind of gooey, but I see now.
Yeah, that's a little muscle still on there.
You want some?
This muscle will be about here.
That's an empty
That one's
shell.
there. Yep. And then there's a muscle
You
here.
want this one?
Nope. I need
You can tell. The bottoms are always going to be more curved and the tops are going to be flat. They also, to some degree, look different depending on where you're getting them from. Like your Blue Point is looking a lot different than your Malpac and your Plymouth and your Scorton Creek.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Inside
That
here,
part, yeah.
yeah, that's fine. That's just a little residue from where the muscle
Sat.
has been sitting, right there. Because what's keeping them clear or tan is that's the area that's connecting with the water when they open up to clean.
What is the significance of, like you see, I heard you say the cup size. Why is that so significant in as far as the oysters
If
concerned?
you look, this one's a little bit deeper of a cup size than the one in my left hand. The cup size is going to retain more liquor.
That's good. And that's
Yeah,
good.
and some people, I will,
Limey juice.
I like to slurp them back, but occasionally what I'll do, I'll take the fork, I'll grab the oyster, I'll eat it, and then I'll pick it up, especially when I'm trying oysters for the first time, and I'll drink that liquor. Because a lot of times the liquor is going to tell me more what the water it's coming out of is doing and playing. And like I said, some oysters will have a salty liquor, but the oyster itself is kind of sweet. So those play.
So that's what makes it salty and sweet.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like
Killing oysters
Yeah.
are open yet.
So it's always fun when you're talking to people. Like for me, it's easy to sell the Beau Soleil because it's such a fun little oyster. It's a perfect cocktail oyster. In size, it's plump, fills that shell. Everyone thinks, oh, I want a big oyster because they feel they're getting their money's worth, but big doesn't always mean it's going to be as good. I'm sure you tasted the Blue Point and the Gulf. Yeah, so these northeastern ones are going to probably taste a lot better than the Gulf, even though the Gulf's probably bigger. But the Beau Soleil, little cocktail guy, it's got a significantly deep cup considering its size. It keeps its nectar. It's very well balanced between sweet, salty, and briny. They float them on top of the water in cages, and once they grow up out of the cage, they just come along with a little, they like grab them with a little hammer and pop them off, clean them up a little bit, and then they stack them very neatly in their boxes and ship them to us clean and beautiful. It's like I said, perfect little cocktail oysters. If you can talk about the fact that Beau Soleil means beautiful sun, and they, keep these in constant sunlight floating on the water, you can intrigue someone to say, you know what, this sounds amazing. You're, very passionate about this oyster. Let's try it. I did it left and right, and you're paying $1.12 per Beau Soleil.
So if they're being shipped in a box, how are they still alive?
If they're in the box?
Yeah.
Because they're
They'll put them in crates or styrofoam with a bunch of like dry ice and stuff, and fly it down.
Gotcha.
And then it goes to distribution plant. It gets divided up from there.
They don't need water
With
to
proper
stay alive.
refrigeration, they say oysters will last up to like a 2-week period.
Oh, without
We're not going to do that. We always try to get oysters just a couple days after they have been harvested, and we will keep them for a couple days. So our oysters from harvest to eating will never exceed a week in time. Especially our local oysters, which the guys are getting out there in their little john boats and bringing them in that morning. That's pretty fresh. But they pretty much have that science down where you can still truly taste the freshness of these oysters when they're getting to us between the dry ice and the packaging and proper handling the whole way. But yes, I would never try to push that envelope on time with oysters. I know when we're shucking and we're handling them, we're going to be the final check and balance to that, because I can get an oyster that was harvested this morning, shucking it, it could still be bad. So it's having a good shucker, knowing what he's doing, that can make that decision that says, it looks good, but I'm just not feeling comfortable about it, and, move on to another oyster. When in doubt, throw it out. It's like I always say with these guys.
Is that why that one's a little more cleaner because it floats more to the top rather than being into the sand?
That's that Connecticut oyster.
Yes. Did you want to taste it?
Which one is it? The
Scorton?
Scorton Creek.
Yeah. The Scortons are,
She likes them.
some of these oysters are much meatier, and meaty oysters also sometimes come off as creamier and stuff. They're plump, they fill up the shell. They're not going to show as clear as that oyster. It's just the environment the oyster's coming out of that's changing that, the nutrition it's eating. I've seen oysters coming out of Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick lately that have a higher metallic, like irons and things in the water than typical, and it's causing the oyster itself to turn teal, like a bluish teal. And the oyster's still good. A lot of people are like, what's going on? I've had probably 50 of them this season, eating them, I'm fine. It's just the minerals in the water that's causing it to do that. So the minerals in that water that's keeping it lighter are gonna come off probably a silky, and maybe more watery in your mouth than like a creaminess.
Do you have all the oysters that are in this packet here?
I have at some of the restaurants I help out with, we've ordered to date there almost 200 different varieties of
Do you
oysters.
have East
So
Beach Blonde
I
oysters?
have East Beach Blondes at both other restaurants I work at right now.
Yeah, those
They
are
are-
the ones that are
One.
tumbled.
I don't know.
They're
Yeah,
tumbled.
they
and they're
tumble
nice
them
and pretty.
to make them nice and smooth. They're very well handled oysters. those
they're
are
tumbled, not rinsed, right?
they power wash them and then they put them in a tumbler. Which the Montauk's, they say that they're tumbling and power washing, but I always get them in and they're always covered in filth.
Yeah, they just
So-
tumble
That's the
them to
question
make
I've
them
gotten
like
in
a
a
good
couple of
shape.
tables is how many times they've been bathed or rinsed.
They shouldn't be rinsing them too often. Typically, in the boats themselves, some guys are using kind of like that water tank we do when we're out fishing that's keeping the water we're in going through them, and they're just keeping them on that's keeping them alive in their natural water. Other guys are pulling them out, putting them in baskets, and taking them back to the dock once they fill all their baskets, instantly packing them on ice and stuff. So it's all a different handling process depending on who you go with, and you'll start noticing the guys that take the time versus the ones that don't. But I would not recommend as like a harvester to table. I wouldn't wash them more than maybe twice. And if they're doing more than that, then they're really, because we're washing them most of the time with fresh water we're getting out of the tap, and they're coming out of salt water. It's like washing your saltwater fish.
Getting rid of the liver. And
Yeah, you're really taking away a lot of its, if it starts like still before you ice it and it's bringing that in, it's going to change its profile
well,
a
that just
lot.
had a few tables asked.
And then the best way I've found to clean them at a restaurant for your drainage things, because the shells go down your drain, you'll have a problem with that. And the hose, I don't feel like always is the most effective way. I just get a bus tub, fill it up halfway with water, dump those oysters in, and I just get in and I do this, and like for less than even a minute, and I just start pulling them out one by one and putting them in and bring them on ice. I have cut myself doing that. Like I said, reaching in like this and doing what I'm doing right now, I've cut myself much more than I have opening them.
So
I've gotten
that was already been
oysters at
had that
home.
done to them. Or
Yeah.
they've just sat.
You can tell these guys are pretty clean, yes,
I've got
on the
ones
outside.
at home, like the clusters or whatever, and I would like always wash them in like warm water, thinking I'm getting all the mud off of them. And
Cold water, just keeping it cold.
killing them
Never
the whole
wash any
time.
seafood.
No wonder why they were so stinky. I was like, that's why I never buy oysters. at
Next
home.
time, get a bucket or something if you have. Make sure it's clean. There's no chemicals or anything bad junk in that bucket. And make that your oyster cleaning bucket. Fill it up with cold to ambient temperature water, and drop the oysters in there and just wish them around. Put a glove on and pull them up. They'll be so much cleaner
And
than they went down.
How long do you cook them when you have them at home?
For an oyster roast, that would definitely be, again, to the person's taste buds. For me, when I'm doing them, you make sure you float them above the water about a ½ inch, and it's the steam that's cooking them. It's not the water. You don't want them bathing in the water. But once I see like a quarter of them have started to open a little bit, I pull the whole batch. From cooking, we all know that things continue to cook even after you've taken them off the heat. But I like having to even get my knife out and, pop them open at that point, because I like my liquor warm. I like my oyster still very plump and juicy, where other guys, other guys cook them until they're all wide open, they're shriveled up, and it looks like I'm getting a canned oyster out of one of those smoked oyster cans. Yeah, if you know what I mean. Yes. So that's how far I would cook them. And
Cook them in the microwave.
And if that's undercooked for people, it's always easy just to throw them back in into the steam there for a minute, That's an easier process than saying, I'm sorry, I overcooked your thing. It's always easier to follow up. Anyone want to try to shuck an oyster?
I will.
Anyone brave enough?
Do what?
Yeah.
I have eaten